34 years old, and with a steady salary of $49,000 a year as a city bus mechanic, sat at a table that cost more than his car. The restaurant was a glittering jewel on Philadelphia's main line, a place called Vernick Table, all polished marble and soft, expensive light. Each place setting was an arsenal of gleaming silverware. He was wearing his best suit, a charcoal gray number from J.C. Penney, that had set him back $189 2 years ago for a cousin's wedding. It felt tight in the shoulders. Across from him, his wife Danica was a vision in a deep blue dress that shimmered like a captured night sky. He knew for a fact it was a $1,700 Roland Mouret because he'd seen the credit card bill he was still paying off. Her father, Vernon, a man whose posture was as starched as his shirts, raised a delicate, long-stemmed glass of wine. The bottle of Sancerre on the table had cost $180, a sum Curtis mentally translated into 4 overtime hours, fixing a busted transmission on a Route 23 bus. Next to Danica sat Richard, a man introduced just an hour before as her mentor from the law firm that had just offered her a position. Richard was handsome, with an easy smile, and a $4,000 Zegna suit that draped perfectly over his athletic frame. To Danica, Vernon began, his voice smooth and deep, carrying across the low hum of the restaurant. My brilliant daughter, a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Law School with honors. She set a goal, and she achieved it with grace and intelligence. It's a profound joy, he paused, letting his gaze drift from his glowing daughter to Curtis, to have one finished product in the family. The air thickened. The words hung there, suspended in the soft light. Danica's smile tightened, a flicker of something, annoyance, embarrassment, in her eyes before it was gone. Richard took a polite sip of his wine, his eyes carefully neutral. Vernon then looked directly at Curtis, offering a thin, dismissive smile. No offense, son. Some people are just unfinished. The word landed like a stone in a quiet pool. Unfinished. It wasn't shouted. It was delivered with the casual, offhand cruelty of a man who had never once in his life worried about the price of a bottle of wine. It was the culmination of 1,000 tiny cuts, a decade of dismissive glances and condescending remarks. Curtis looked at the man who had just summed up his entire life, his sacrifices, his unending labor, in a single, damning word. He looked at his wife, who said nothing, her silence a ringing endorsement. He felt a strange calm settle over him, a clarity so sharp and cold it was almost painful. The tension in his shoulders from the too-tight suit jacket seemed to dissolve. He looked down at his plate, at the artfully arranged piece of sea bass that probably cost $50. He picked up his fork, a heavy, ornate piece of silver worth more than the tools in his pocket. He held it for a moment, feeling its weight. Then, with a quiet, deliberate motion, he placed the fork down beside his plate. The faint clink of metal on fine china was the only sound he made. It was a small sound, but in the sudden, echoing silence at their table, it felt like a gavel coming down. He was done eating. He was done pretending. He was finished. 10 years earlier, Curtis had been anything but unfinished. He had been on the precipice of everything. At 24, he held an acceptance letter from the University of Pennsylvania School of Engineering and Applied Science. It was his dream, a tangible paper and ink promise of a different life than the one he'd known, growing up in Olney, where futures were often dictated by circumstance, not ambition. The letter represented a path to becoming a mechanical engineer, to designing the very transit systems he'd spent his life riding. He had saved for years, working 2 jobs since high school, accumulating a nest egg of just over $28,000. It wasn't enough for all 4 years, but it was a powerful start. He remembered the day he told Danica, spreading the letter out on the worn kitchen table of the small duplex he'd just inherited from his grandmother. The house was modest, a simple brick-fronted row home, but it was theirs, and it was paid for. His grandmother, a woman whose wisdom was as sturdy as her cast-iron pans, had left it to him free and clear. "A man needs a place to stand," she'd always said. "The rest you can build?" Danica had read the letter, her eyes wide. Then she'd started to cry. They weren't tears of joy for him. They were tears of despair for herself. Her own dreams of becoming a lawyer felt impossibly distant. Her grades were good, but her family's finances were a wreck, and the idea of taking on 6 figures of debt terrified her into paralysis. "You're going to go off and be this brilliant engineer," she'd sobbed, her head buried in his shoulder, "and I'll just be here, stuck." He held her, his own joy curdling into a knot of guilt. He loved her. He loved the way her mind worked, the way she could argue a point with a fierce intelligence that left him breathless. He believed in her dream as much as he believed in his own. That night, sitting at that worn table, surrounded by the floral wallpaper his grandmother had chosen 30 years prior, he made a decision. He looked at his acceptance letter, the culmination of all his work, and then he looked at the woman he loved, her face streaked with tears, her deep brown skin looking fragile in the dim light. "You go," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You go to law school, I'll work. We have the house, so there's no rent. We can use my savings for your tuition. I can get a good union job with the city, with SEPTA. The benefits are solid. I'll support us while you study. When you're a lawyer, when we're stable, then I'll go back to school. I can do night classes." He deferred his admission. Penn was gracious, offering him a 5-year window to reconsider. Drexel offered an even more flexible deferred admission to their night engineering program. He tucked the letters away in a fireproof box with his grandmother's deed. It felt like planting a seed that he would tend to later. He had no idea he was burying it. The next 10 years were a blur of grease, sweat, and sacrifice. He got the job as a bus mechanic for the city. The pay was decent, starting at $42,000 and slowly climbing to the $49,000 he made now. The work was grueling. He spent his days in a cavernous garage in South Philly, the air thick with the smell of diesel and solvent, wrestling with engines the size of refrigerators. He came home with his hands stained black, the kind of grime that never fully washed out from under his fingernails. But he was a good mechanic. He was meticulous, patient. He found a quiet satisfaction in diagnosing a complex electrical problem or rebuilding a failing hydraulic system. He treated each bus as a puzzle, and he was proud of his work. He was keeping the city moving, connecting people to their jobs, their families, their lives. All his energy, all his resources flowed in one direction, Danica. He paid the first semester's tuition at Temple's undergraduate program with a cashier's check for $7,800 drawn directly from his savings account. The next semester was another $7,950. He kept every receipt, every bank statement, in the same fireproof box as the deed. He packed her lunches in the morning before he left for his 6 a.m. shift. He'd make her coffee, leaving it in a $30 thermos on the counter. He did the oil changes on her 2010 Honda Civic himself, saving them the $80 fee at the local shop. He learned to cook, making hearty $25 stews and casseroles that could last them for days. Their life was built on his labor, and the foundation was the simple, unshakable belief that they were a team. When she got into Penn Law 3 years later, the financial demands escalated exponentially. The tuition was a staggering $55,000 a year. His savings were long gone. "We'll need loans," she'd said, her face pale as she looked at the acceptance packet. "But my dad will co-sign. He has the credit for it. Don't you worry about it." Curtis trusted her. He picked up every overtime shift he could get. While she was buying $400 textbooks on torts and civil procedure, he was putting off buying the new pair of $150 Red Wing work boots he desperately needed, his old ones held together with duct tape. When her laptop died in the middle of her second year, he didn't hesitate. He went to the Apple store and put a brand new $1,200 MacBook Air on his credit card, a card he was still paying down with an 18% interest rate. For her, nothing was too much. She was the investment. He was just the capital. And he had no idea how wrong he was. The betrayal didn't happen all at once. It was a slow erosion, a gradual chilling of the warmth that had once defined their home. The first 2 years of law school were hard, but they still felt like a team. It was in her third and final year that the cracks began to show, widening into fissures he could no longer ignore. The change was personified by her new wardrobe. "I need to look the part for these networking events, Curtis," she explained one evening, pulling a sleek black blazer from a shopping bag. It was from Theory, a brand he'd never heard of. It cost $600. "It's all about presentation. It's not just about grades." He was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to scrub the grease from his hands with a coarse, orange-scented soap. He looked at the blazer, then at his own worn work clothes, and nodded. "Of course, honey. Whatever you need." He took another overtime shift that weekend, working a double on a Saturday to fix a fleet of buses with faulty brakes. The extra $440 before taxes would cover most of it. Soon, there were more networking events, more study groups that ran late into the night. She started talking about her classmates, their summer internships at prestigious firms in New York, their parents who were partners at law firms or federal judges. Her stories were filled with names of restaurants he'd never been to, and vacation spots he'd only seen in magazines. One Tuesday night, he decided to surprise her. He'd made her favorite, a rich beef chili that cost $30 in ingredients and took 3 hours to simmer. He carefully packed it in a container, grabbed a piece of cornbread, and drove the 2012 Toyota Camry to Penn's campus. He found her in the law school's library, not alone in a carrel as he'd pictured, but at a large table with a group of 4 other students. They were all impeccably dressed. Their laughter was loud and confident. On the table, beside their sleek laptops, were several designer handbags, a $3,000 Yves Saint Laurent tote, a Gucci crossbody. He approached the table, holding the bag with the chili. "Hey, honey, I brought you dinner. Figured you were hungry." Danica looked up, and her smile was instant and bright, but her eyes were mortified. "Curtis, what are you doing here?" she hissed under her breath, standing up and pulling him aside. "I told you I was in a study session." "I just wanted to bring you something to eat," he said, confused. Her friends were watching, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and condescension. One of them, a blonde girl with a severe haircut, looked him up and down, her gaze lingering on his faded jeans and the faint smell of industrial soap that clung to him. "This is my husband Curtis," Danica said to the group, her voice strained. She didn't invite him to sit. She didn't introduce him to anyone by name. She took the food from him as if it were a package she was signing for. "Thanks, baby. This is so sweet. But we're really in the middle of something." It was a dismissal, clear and cold. He drove home to the Olney duplex, the smell of chili filling the car, and ate his own dinner alone at the kitchen table. He felt a profound sense of shame, but he couldn't articulate why. He had just been trying to do something nice. He was being supportive. But in that gleaming cathedral-like library, surrounded by the children of privilege, his support suddenly looked clumsy and unwelcome. It looked poor. The public humiliations grew more frequent, more pointed. At a family barbecue at her parents' sprawling home in Gladwin, a $2.5 million stone manor that always made him feel like he should be using the service entrance, her father cornered him by the grill. "So, Curtis," Vernon said, swirling a glass of what was probably very expensive bourbon, "Danica tells me you're still tinkering with those buses. A man needs ambition, you know, a plan." Curtis kept his eyes on the burgers he was flipping. "The job pays the bills, Vernon. It's honest work." "Honest, yes," Vernon conceded, as if it were a minor virtue. "But is it fulfilling? Don't you want more?" Before Curtis could answer, Danica walked over, linking her arm through her father's. She'd overheard. "Daddy, be nice," she said, with a light, tinkling laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Someone has to keep the city moving for the rest of us." She meant it as a deflection, a way to smooth over her father's condescension, but the words landed like a slap. The rest of us. She had drawn a line, placing herself and her father on one side, and him on the other. He wasn't part of us anymore. He was the help. He was the guy who fixed the bus. Later that night, as they were driving home in his Camry, the silence in the car was heavy. "You know," she said finally, looking out the window at the passing city lights, "he has a point in a way. You have to admit, it's not exactly a career, it's a job." She delivered the word job as if it were a diagnosis, as if it were something to be ashamed of. He thought of his hands, calloused and stained. He thought of the intricate engine schematics he could read like a novel. He thought of the pride he felt when a bus he'd worked on pulled smoothly out of the depot, and he realized with a sickening lurch that she didn't see any of that. She just saw the grease. The final, irrevocable piece of the puzzle clicked into place 6 months before her graduation. Danica had been acting strangely for weeks. Secretive phone calls she'd take in the other room, a new perfume she wore that smelled like money, and a general air of distraction. He was looking for a spare battery in the back of their shared closet when his hand brushed against a shoebox tucked away on the top shelf. It wasn't his. Curiosity, a feeling he rarely indulged, got the better of him. He pulled it down. Inside, nestled among some old papers, was a stack of credit card statements for a card he didn't know she had, a Visa signature card, in her name only. He sat on the edge of their bed, the bed he'd assembled himself with a $40 Allen key set, and began to read. The statements told a story of a life he was not a part of. There was a charge for $780 at Vernick Fish, a high-end seafood restaurant, on a night she had supposedly been at a late-night study marathon. There was a weekend charge for $1,250 at the Lodge at Woodlock, a luxury spa resort in the Poconos, from a month when she claimed to be on a university-sponsored retreat. There were dozens of smaller charges, $150 lunches, $200 bar tabs, a $500 shopping spree at the King of Prussia Mall. He felt the blood drain from his face. It wasn't just the money, it was the elaborate, sustained deception. He was working 60-hour weeks, eating overtime shifts like they were candy, to fund a life she was living with someone else. The shame he'd felt in the library returned, but this time it was mixed with a cold, hard rage. He didn't confront her. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. Never fight a fire with gasoline. Fight it with water, quiet and steady. An open confrontation would lead to tears, denials, and probably, somehow, him apologizing. He needed something more than accusations. He needed facts. He needed a plan. The next morning, Curtis called in sick to work for the first time in 5 years. He told his supervisor he had a stomach bug, his voice convincingly weak. In reality, he felt a steely resolve he hadn't known he possessed. He spent the morning at the local branch of his credit union, the place where he'd opened his first savings account as a teenager. He requested copies of every statement from the past 10 years. The branch manager, a kind woman named Maria, who had known his grandmother, printed them for him without question. He laid them out on the kitchen table, the same table where he'd made his fateful promise to Danica. He traced the withdrawals with his finger. The first big one? $7,000.